Stephen Studdert, former senior White House advisor to Presidents Bush and Reagan. Thank you so much for being part of Three Questions.
Happy to do it.
You were invited to the funeral services for President George H.W. Bush. You served as a very close senior advisor for him and for President Reagan as well. We sometimes elevate people in death. You knew the 41st president very well. Is that the case this time?
You know, it was an interesting experience for me as we sat in the National Cathedral, and there were, former presidents, current president, first ladies, vice presidents, secretaries of state, all the current president's cabinet, athletic stars, people who served in the government, and people who were just average people in that cathedral. It was really interesting that there were no titles or ranks. It would have been Bob and Steve. Henry Kissinger and I had a wonderful little visit, and it was Henry and Steve, not Mr. Secretary, because they were all there as friends of George Bush first. They were honoring their friend first, former President of the United States second.
Did they make him larger in death than he was in life, do you think?
No. It was an appropriately respectful funeral, but it reflected his modesty and his humility in every measure. It was very, very tastefully done, elegantly done. Remember, he is also the commander-in-chief, and the military was bearing a former commander-in-chief, and so there are many military components of it that were absolutely beautiful.
You took part in a lot of the pomp and circumstance of bidding farewell to the 41st President of the United States. During your time there, what stands out as the most poignant or meaningful to you?
I had an aisle seat, and as there were many, but one that comes to mind, as they were recessing from the cathedral, the 43rd President of the United States walked within 3 inches of me. And he nodded and winked at me with tears streaming down his face. And it just struck me that he's the 43rd President of the United States, but today he's a son, mourning his father. That was, for me, the most poignant moment. The other one was Bob Dole, standing in the rotunda and saluting a fallen comrade. And he can't stand, but do or die, he was going to stand to render a salute.
To see the current and former living presidents of the United States all lined up on the front row of the National Cathedral there, I mean, that was quite a picture. I mean, and that's a very exclusive club in which...
Very expensive admission.
Yes, and in fact, politics is largely put aside in that club.
Yes.
But with the presence of President Trump there, I sensed a little bit of tension in the air. What did you make of that?
Well, if you look at all the others on that front row, they've had a lifetime in the political arena. So they understand the environment, the subtleties, the nuances. For President Trump, it's a new experience for him. And it is unique that we don't in this country. It's the rarest of occasion when all the living former presidents and the current president and all the first ladies and all the vice presidents and their wives are together in the same place. It just doesn't happen. Probably the last time it happened was President Reagan's funeral. And so, and I think President Trump was maybe a little, that this was not his event, this was a family event. So he was respectful of that. I saw some criticism in the media that he didn't walk down the front row and shake everybody's hand. It wasn't appropriate to do that then. He came in and was seated, leaned over, and he shook hands with the Obamas. He waved at Bill Clinton. I noticed that Mrs. Clinton, eyes forward. There was still a little bit of political animosity going there.
As you look back at your years in the White House when you served President Ford first, and then President Reagan, and then President Bush, as you look at those presidencies, how would you describe the defining moments of each one of those presidencies?
For Gerald Ford, I suppose the defining moment, which maybe it turned out to be a negative for him, was the pardon of Richard Nixon. But for the country to get moving forward, it had to be done. It was the right decision in my view. I think for Ronald Reagan, it was going against the advice of his own senior staff, and especially the State Department and our diplomatic corps, in saying at the Berlin Wall, at the Brandenburg Gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And I think for George Bush, it was a negative again. Now, for him, clearly the positive was he brought about the peaceful end of the Cold War. It's the first time in 1,100 years we've had a major change like that happen without war. There was no war at the end of the Cold War. But I think the defining moment, which may have cost him the election, was he said 10,000 times campaigning, read my lips, no new taxes. I heard him.
We all did.
And when they did that budget deal, it was perceived as a tax increase.
How does the office of the presidency change the person who occupies that office?
You know, I was with President Reagan 3 weeks after he took office, and we found ourselves, he was speaking at an event at a hotel, and we found ourselves alone in the holding room before the event. And I said to him, Mr. President, you've been there 3 weeks, how is it? And it was a profound statement. He said, I don't have enough time to think about America. And the way it changes them is that all of a sudden they realize that 320 million people's lives depend upon them. They become inwardly and often outwardly more spiritual because they are sending young men and young women who wear this country's uniform into harm's way, often to death. And the presidents that I've served, that was a very sobering decision for them to make. And so I think it changes them in that regard. George Washington said we're dependent upon the hand of Providence. Each of the presidents I served grew more so the longer they served in that office.
We're coming to the end of 2 years of the Trump administration so far. How would you characterize his leadership style and his treatment of the office of the president?
You know, each president treats it differently. The ones I served had enormous respect for the office of the president, and they recognized that it was the people's business that they were about. I think Trump recognizes that also. But remember, President Trump comes from a lifetime of being a building developer in Queens, New York, where the style is very, very different, where the subtleties and nuances and political trades just aren't part of that world. But I see him, I think he's growing in the office. I see him being more delicate on some things. I'm very pleased with a lot of the things he's accomplishing. I wish he would tweet less.
Which leads me to my next question. If you were a senior advisor to President Donald Trump, what would you advise him in regard to immigration, the Mueller investigation, trade, Twitter, those kinds of things? What would you tell him?
You know, that's a hypothetical, so I'm not sure what the answer is because the council might change from one day to the next. I was with a man just this morning at breakfast in Washington, D.C., who was renewing his invitation for me to rejoin this administration, and I, for the third time, said, no, thank you. I'm very happy home in Utah. Give it to a younger man. You know, one of the things that it's going to change now that the Democrats control the House beginning January and the Republicans control the Senate, it's a different dynamic. So the whole decision-making process is different on those issues that you just mentioned. The president will have to be more collegial and have to work with both sides of the aisle now more than he's had to do in the first 2 years.
Do you think he has it in him?
I don't think he has any choice. If you want to accomplish things in a bicameral legislature where one house is controlled by one party and the other house is controlled by the other party, you've got to work together. Reagan had that experience where he had control differences and he worked with both sides.
How has social media changed the way we conduct politics in this country?
Completely. I remember before social media, when presidents were campaigning or in the office, they would have the story of the day. And it was all crafted and it was timed and so on to meet the 6 o'clock news, if you will. Today, now it's a 24-hour news cycle and it's instantaneous with social media. Elections in the future will be almost completely dependent on social media. It has changed the way everyone in the White House conducts themselves. And you know, it's interesting also, if you're in a crowd of 500 people have a camera with their cell phone. And so that's an element of social media, which has completely changed the way not only the president, but his entire administration conducts themselves.
Should President Trump tweet more or less?
I don't have an answer to that. I sometimes wish they would be a little less controversial, a little less combative. But that's his style. And he has accomplished an enormous amount of the things he campaigned to do, especially with judiciary appointments.
Is it worth the cost in hard feelings among those who don't like him?
Personally, I don't think so. George Bush talked about his inaugural address, a kinder, gentler America. I prefer that. It's just a personal preference of mine, but I think we're better off as a people when we're much more united. We can, you know, the good book says, let us counsel together. And wise leaders can do that and accomplish amazing things. And you and I can disagree on policy, but that doesn't mean we have to be disagreeable.
As a leader, is it better to be feared or respected?
Respected.
Why?
Well, for example, George Bush, this is his week, as a leader of the free world, oftentimes he would pick up the phone if he had 5 spare minutes and phone some world leader, head of state. Because there was no crisis, he said, I'm just calling to get your thoughts or counsel on this idea or this particular issue, rather than just calling when we need each other in a crisis. And what came as a result of that was a working relationship on a first-name basis with all of the major heads of state of the world. And we didn't go to war.
Yeah. As evidenced by Brian Mulroney being asked to speak at his funeral.
And his remarks were wonderful, weren't they?
Oh, yeah.
And that was a great compliment that, you know, our closest ally, our major neighbor, that the former head of Canada was a speaker at the funeral. That said a lot. And he spoke about George, his friend.
You served President Gerald Ford, you've served President Ronald Reagan, you've served George H.W. Bush. You have seen the arc of those presidencies. How would you describe a successful president of the United States?
That he survives, both politically, but also, you know, I mean, I was there when Ronald Reagan was almost assassinated. The risks, personally, to the man or woman who holds that office are enormous. They're constant. And in the evolving world of risk management, terrorism, drones are changing the entire issue of security of the president. That's becoming a much bigger issue. But really, what's good is if when they complete their term of office, whether it's 4 years or 8, they feel good about what they did for America. And that when they walk out of that office at noon on January 20th, as they all will do with certainty, unless they leave earlier for whatever reason, that they hold their head high and feel a great sense of accomplishment and feel a partnership with the American people.
Is there a public barometer at which we can point and say, because of that, this president was successful?
Oh, yes. But oftentimes those are in hindsight. But you can look back at the presidents that I served, and you can find that barometer. It's there. It's there for every one of them. And for example, President Carter, you look at the barometer for his presidency. That was not a positive. It was the Iran hostages. 52 Americans held for 444 days. And that will always be the principal measurement of his presidency. And that will score as a failure, unfortunately.
You describe a moment that didn't ever happen in the Ronald Reagan presidential inaugural, right on the cusp of those Iran hostages being released. Tell us about that. Tell us what was planned.
I don't think this has ever been written anywhere. President-elect Reagan took 2 of us aside, and we knew that the hostages were being released that day. And his hope was they'd be released during President Carter's administration, which ended at noon. And they weren't released by noon. And he gave us an indication that if we do this to him, it would be a signal that the hostages have cleared Iranian airspace. And he was going to stop his inaugural address and turn and invite President Carter to stand and speak to the crowd, because this was his moment, his accomplishment. And he would look at us. I was on one side and a colleague was on the other side. And he would look occasionally, and he was looking for this signal, which never came. They cleared Iranian airspace about 2 hours after he finished his inaugural address. President Reagan sent President Carter and Vice President Mondale as his representatives and the representatives of America to Wiesbaden, Germany, to welcome those hostages to freedom.
You describe a far more collegial time in politics in Washington when you served there actively in those administrations. We are lacking that now. That collegiality seems to have escaped us. Why has it escaped us, and how do we get back to it?
I think it has to do with money. I've thought a lot about it. In days past, everybody that was a member of the Senate or House, 535 of them, were beholden to political parties and to platforms and to party leadership, etc. Not today. Today they're beholden to donors. So campaign finance has made, instead of having some unity, one or two voices, you got 535 voices on the Hill now. You've got 24-hour news cycles where there's an audience at any moment, and as you mentioned, they have social media access. In days past, they didn't have that. The only one that really had the bully pulpit was the president. Teddy Roosevelt talked a lot about that, and the president could use it in ways that nobody else can. Now everybody can.
You have been a keen observer of American culture your entire adult life. In fact, you wrote a book in recent years entitled America in Danger. What dangers does America face now, and which of them is the biggest concern?
You know, I'd name 4 of them that are serious concerns to those who deal with risk to this country. I was in a luncheon meeting today in Washington, D.C., where actually one of these came up, and it's the cyber threat to this country. Our defense leaders have said we have an entire defense infrastructure, which includes naval vessels, aircraft, on land, etc., that is completely vulnerable to an electromagnetic pulse bomb attack. Okay, and when asked the question, are we protected? Their answer today is no, we are not. So cyber attack is an enormous risk. In fact, one of these people at lunch today said that there is some intelligence estimate that suggests that next year there'll be a cyber attack to bring down the entire cellular network of the United States. Now, were that to happen, and it's not protected, were that to happen, imagine the economic impact on this country. But cyber attack is one. Biological or nuclear attack is always another one. The Iranians now may have seaborne nuclear weapons. They could sail right up the Chesapeake Bay and launch one at Washington, D.C. Pandemic diseases is another one. Right now there's maybe the largest Ebola outbreak ever going on in the Congo, and it's not being contained well, and they can get on planes and fly to, you know,
all over the place.
Any ways they want to go in a matter of hours. And the 4th one that I would mention is our national debt. One of these days, it is simply going to tip us over financially. We have $21 trillion in current debt. We have, by some estimates, over $200 trillion in total government obligations. It is simply impossible to repay that.
Finally, you started out as the police chief of Brigham City.
Well, it was kind of an accident in my career, and one I loved.
Then you went on to become a city councilman in Bountiful. You've been a political operative your entire life.
No, I don't like politics.
Why have you not run for higher office?
You know, people have asked me and encouraged me to run, and it's just not something I've ever been wanting to do. I've been able to give, I hope, some valuable public service, service in my religion, service in my community, without being elected. There's other people I'd rather support them.
Is it still out of the question?
Oh yeah, I'm an old man. Come on. No,
Not that old.
I have no fire in my belly to ever do that. Never have had.
Well, finally, Stephen Studdert, former senior White House advisor to Presidents Reagan and Bush, thank you so much for being part of 3 Questions.
Thanks, Bob. My privilege.